a historical romance. She found his letters, years too late, a love story, lost in the smoke of war, prologue. Italy, 1977. The country was a trembling thing, caught between old ghosts and new wars. In the north, factories coughed smoke into the sky, chasing a future few could touch. In the south, hunger still clung to the bones of children. And across the centre, in forgotten hills and crumbling towns, silence stretched like a second skin over the earth. Volterra was one of those places, built of stone and sorrow, sitting high above the valleys like a watchful old woman. It had weathered centuries of storms, blood, and whispered promises. The streets twisted like veins. The houses leaned into each other like gossips. Every cracked wall, every broken step, carried the weight of things never spoken aloud. Here, time did not move forward. It only thickened. Families had lived in Volterra for generations, fighting the same battles their grandparents had fought. Land, pride, reputation. Nothing was more sacred than the family name, and nothing more dangerous than the rumours that could stain it. Amara's family had lived on the edge of that town longer than memory allowed. Their name, once shouted with pride, had faded into a muttered afterthought. Poor farmers, stubborn fools. People said the Rinaldis clung to their dirt farm the way a drowning man clung to a sinking ship. Her grandfather had once led a protest against the wealthy landowners, waving a banner stitched by Amara's grandmother herself. It had ended in jail and shame. The Rinaldis had never recovered. Amara grew up among fields that cracked under the sun and winters that gnawed at the bones. She learned early that dreams were dangerous things. Better to keep your head down. Better to not want. But in the quiet hours, when no one was watching, Amara would sketch tiny worlds into the dirt with a broken stick. Gardens that bloomed, rivers that sang, cities that glittered on faraway shores. Dreams, she told herself, were for people born into softer lives. Yet still, she dreamed. On the other side of town, in a dusty little bookshop that always smelled of ink and damp wood, Ezra lived his own kind of prison. His family, the Marconis, were neither rich nor poor. But in Volterra, money was not the only measure of a man's worth. The Marconis had come from elsewhere decades ago, and that elsewhere was enough to keep them always a little outside, a little suspect. Ezra was a boy made of questions in a place that only wanted answers. Why must life be this way? Why did some names open doors while others slammed them shut? Why did love in this town feel like a battlefield already lost before it began? He read to escape. History, philosophy, forbidden poetry. He hid his favourite books under the loose floorboard beneath his bed, as if the words themselves were crimes. He dreamed, too, of Florence, of Rome, of cities where nobody knew his name, where he could become someone new. But dreams, he had learned, did not put food on the table or mend broken fathers. The world around them cracked and shifted, slow and merciless as a glacier. Politics turned brother against brother. Churches whispered about sin and duty. Families locked their daughters away behind heavy doors. Hope in Volterra was something you buried like a seed and prayed nobody noticed. It was into this brittle, aching world that Amara Rinaldi and Ezra Marconi were born. And it was here, against every warning, every law, and every trembling fear, that they would find each other. Not because it was easy, not because they were foolish, but because sometimes, even in a dying town, two broken hearts can beat loud enough to wake the dead. The year the world changed. The year was 1978, the year when Volterra for all its thick walls and thicker silences, could no longer keep the world out. It began with whispers, quiet at first, like the sound of rain behind a closed window. Whispers of students marching in Rome, whispers of bombs in Milan, whispers of angry men with nothing left to lose. The newspapers arrived late in Volterra, wrinkled and stained, passed from hand to hand until the ink blurred under too many fingers. But the news still came, and even the oldest men, sitting like tired statues outside the cafe, felt the ground shifting under them. Amara was 17 that spring. She remembered the day it truly began, because the first thunderstorm of the season had cracked the sky open like a broken mirror. She had been in the fields with her father, dragging stones out of the wet earth when the radio crackled to life. Her father's hands that had never once hesitated in the face of hard work, had frozen mid-air. "Another bombing," he said, voice low and tight. "This time in Bologna." They said it quickly after that. "It's not our problem. It's city business. It won't touch us." But fear was a hungry thing, and once it caught a scent, it came running. Prices at the market soared. Food became harder to buy. Men who once nodded politely in the square now crossed the street to avoid each other. The church bells, which had always marked the hours with soft familiarity, began to sound like warnings. At home, Amara's mother grew quieter, wrapping herself in old prayers and older superstitions. Her father spent longer hours in town, meeting behind closed doors with other farmers, voices raised and bitter. And Amara, who had always obeyed, who had always hidden her longing behind quiet hands and lowered eyes, found herself dreaming harder. Not just of distant cities anymore, not just of rivers and gardens and unnamed lovers, but of a different life altogether, one where fear didn't eat you alive from the inside out, one where love wasn't just a risk, but a revolution. She began to stay out longer after her chores were finished, walking alone on the crumbling paths that wound through the hills. It was on one of those walks, in the dying light of a tired sun, that she first saw him. Ezra, standing alone by the old fountain in the abandoned part of town, flipping a battered coin through his fingers like he was bargaining with fate itself. He didn't see her, not at first. He was too lost in his own head, eyes dark and far away. But something in that lonely figure, something in the way he seemed to carry the weight of the whole crumbling town in his shoulders, rooted her to the spot. She would have turned away. She should have. Good girls didn't speak to boys alone, especially not strange boys, especially not ones from suspect families. But then he looked up, and for a moment, one impossible, aching moment, it felt like the whole world held its breath. The boy with the broken smile. Ezra knew how to disappear before he ever learned how to fight. By the age of 12, he could slip through town like a ghost, speaking only when spoken to, avoiding the sharp eyes of the elders and the sharper words of his father. His world was a thin, crumbling house at the edge of Volterra, where the stones sweated salt and the roof leaked when it rained too hard. Inside, silence grew like mould. His father, once a proud carpenter, spent most days nursing bottles more than nails now, his big hands trembling with a fury he no longer bothered to aim. His mother, a small woman whose laughter had once lit rooms on fire, moved like a shadow between kitchen and bedroom, wearing silence like armour. Ezra hated and loved them both in equal measure. He hated them for giving up. He loved them because they were all he had. At 16, he had scars no one saw, a split lip that never quite healed right after a bad winter, a crooked pinky from the time he had dared speak back, and deeper wounds, the kind that made you afraid to hope at all. Every morning he rose before the sun, slipping out into the misty streets to work odd jobs, mending broken fences, hauling sacks of grain, fixing shutters that screamed against the wind. He was saving, he told himself, saving for a life somewhere else, anywhere but here. But somewhere deep down, a crueler voice whispered, "You are your father's son. You will rot here too." That afternoon by the fountain, he hadn't meant to stay long. He had been looking for scraps of metal to sell, for anything he could turn into a few lira. But when he flipped that old coin in his hand, something heavier than money weighed in his chest. Nothing ever changes here, he thought bitterly. And then he looked up and saw her. A girl, half hidden behind the leaning cypress trees, skirts brushing the dusty path, hair tangled by the spring wind. Amara. He didn't know her name yet, but he knew the look in her eyes, that restless, burning look. It was the same look he saw sometimes when he caught his reflection in the black windows of closed shops. Hope. Foolish, reckless hope. For a heartbeat, they simply stared at each other. Two broken things really seeing each other. Ezra's first instinct was to turn away. Good boys from broken families didn't look too long at girls like her, the kind of girl who still believed the world could be gentle. But something inside him, something stubborn and hungry, refused. He offered her the smallest of smiles, crooked, uncertain, almost painful, and then he turned and walked away, hands shoved deep in the pockets of his worn jacket, heart pounding so hard he thought it might break through his ribs. He didn't see the small, hesitant smile she gave him in return. But he felt it, like the first real thing he had been given in a long, long time. A smile, a glance, a war. In a town like Volterra, even the smallest things grew teeth. A glance held too long, a smile exchanged when no one else was smiling, a missed curfew, a rumour dropped like a pebble into a still pond, rippling outward until it swallowed everything. At first, Amara and Ezra's meetings were accidents, a shared path through the olive groves, an overlap at the market stalls when old Signora Ricci shouted about the price of lentils, a pause at the broken fountain where the dust clung to their shoes and their shadows touched, almost by mistake. They spoke in fragments. "Hello, nice day. Be careful, the road's muddy." Each word felt like a tiny rebellion, like writing their names in places they weren't allowed to exist. Ezra would look down when he spoke, scuffing his boots against the stones. Amara would tuck stray strands of hair behind her ear, hiding her smile behind bitten lips. But it was there, the beginning of something. A soft, trembling thing trying to bloom in the middle of drought and dust. The town noticed before either of them could name it. The baker's wife watched them with narrowed eyes as she kneaded her dough, fingers pressing deep like she could crush whatever was growing between them. The priest at Sunday Mass began speaking more heavily about temptation, casting glances that made Amara's skin crawl. Old men muttered into their wine at dusk. Mothers pulled their daughters closer when Ezra walked by, like his sadness was something you could catch like a disease. Even at home, the air grew heavier. Her mother's prayers became sharper, faster, slipping through the rooms like knives. Her father, who used to greet her with tired affection, now frowned deeper each evening, his fingers tapping a nervous rhythm on the kitchen table. "Stay away from that boy," he said once, voice low but cutting. "His family carries shame." He didn't need to say more. In Volterra, old sins were inherited like bad land. Ezra too felt the weight. Neighbours stopped offering him work. Doors closed faster when he walked by, and his father, drunk and bitter, caught the scent of trouble like a hunting dog. "You think you're better than us now," he slurred one night, pushing Ezra hard against the doorframe. "You think love will save you? You're a fool. You're nothing." Ezra didn't answer. There was no point. The only answer he wanted to give was hidden in the way Amara's eyes lit up when she laughed, in the way her fingers brushed his when she handed him a coin at the market, lingering for just one heartbeat longer than necessary, in the way he began to dream again, for the first time in years. But dreams had a cost. One rainy afternoon, as they sheltered under the crumbling roof of an abandoned shed near the fields, Amara whispered, "Maybe we should stop." Her voice was so small, it almost broke him. He looked at her, really looked, at the tremble in her hands, the worry gnawing at the corners of her mouth. He wanted to say yes. He wanted to be noble, to spare her the war that was already sharpening its claws. Instead, he reached for her hand. "I don't want to stop," he said, voice raw and certain. For a moment, she squeezed his fingers back, and in that tiny, reckless act, that one impossible choice, they declared war on everything, on the town, on history, on fear itself, when whispers turned to screams. It started with a stone through a window, a sharp crack in the dead of night, a rush of broken glass spilling onto the kitchen floor. Amara woke with a scream lodged in her throat, heart pounding against her ribs like a bird against a cage. Her father cursed, grabbing the rusted shotgun he hadn't touched since the war. Her mother prayed, fast and broken, the words tripping over each other in her panic. Outside, there was only darkness and silence, and the cold knowledge that someone, maybe many someones, had decided to stop whispering. Ezra wasn't safe either. The day after the window shattered, he found the remains of what used to be his cart, the one he used to haul wood and water for the richer families. It was burned to a black skeleton at the edge of the olive grove, still smoking, still stinking of gasoline and hate. He stood there for a long time, the smell of it thick in his nose, his fists clenching until his nails drew blood from his palms. They were sending a message. He wasn't wanted, not here, not anywhere. That night, his father laughed into his beer and muttered, "They finally see you for what you are." Ezra said nothing, but deep inside, something began to harden, a steel wire wrapping tighter around his heart. He would not bow, not to them, not for anything. Amara's world tightened like a noose. She was no longer allowed to walk alone, no longer permitted to run errands or slip away to the fields. Her mother shadowed her like a ghost, praying louder and more often, stuffing rosemary under her mattress to ward off evil thoughts. But it was her father who broke her. One evening, as the sun bled red across the stone walls, he sat her down at the kitchen table, the same table where she had eaten soup, sewn clothes, dreamed her tiny dreams. "You are not to see him again," he said, voice calm but brittle, like glass about to shatter. Amara opened her mouth to protest, but he slammed his hand down hard enough to rattle the plates. "Do you understand?" Tears blurred her vision, but she nodded, because defiance here wasn't brave, it was suicide. Later that night, she cried into her pillow, biting down on the fabric to muffle the sound. She hated herself for nodding, hated the fear that lived inside her bones now, hated the way love, pure, simple love, had turned into a war she didn't know how to win. They met again, anyway. Of course they did. Two moths drawn to the same dying flame. In the ruins of the old vineyard, hidden from the eyes that watched and the mouths that gossiped, they found each other. Ezra touched the bruise on Amara's wrist, a silent question. She shook her head, swallowing back the tears. I can't breathe without you, she whispered, voice breaking. Ezra pressed his forehead to hers, his hands trembling where they clutched her. I'll find a way, he said. I swear it. But promises made in the dark carried a different kind of weight. He didn't tell her about the threats, the burned cart, the men who had followed him home the night before, laughing about broken legs and broken necks. She didn't tell him about the letters her father had written, desperate appeals to a cousin in Florence, offering her like cattle in marriage to a man she had never met. They both clung to the lie that love would be enough, even as the noose tightened around them, even as the first real crack split their world in two, love in ruins. They became shadows, two people slipping through alleys at dusk, mouths pressed tight against sobs of frustration. They spoke in whispers. They touched like their hands might be torn apart if they held too long. Ezra and Amara carved out minutes together, stolen from work, from chores, from the ever-watchful eyes of a town sharpening its knives. In the burnt-out vineyard, they made promises in between the creaking vines. We'll leave, Ezra said one night, voice hoarse with desperation. His hands trembled as he brushed a stray lock of hair from her face. There's a ship leaving Livorno next month. I have a friend. He says he can get us aboard. Amara's heart slammed against her ribs. The word leave tasted like both freedom and death. She thought of her mother's prayers, her father's rage, her brothers who walked the house like jailers. She thought of a future where she could wake in Ezra's arms without fear, a future where love didn't have to hide. I'll go anywhere, she whispered, as long as it's with you. They kissed with the frantic urgency of people who knew time was running out. And maybe, somewhere deep inside, they both already knew they wouldn't make it. Ezra worked double shifts in the olive fields, saving every coin, bleeding from his palms. He hid the money beneath a loose floorboard in his tiny bedroom. Every day the rumours thickened like smoke. Every day he saw more hatred in the glances thrown his way. He caught sight of a group once, boys he had grown up with, standing outside the tavern, carving something into the wooden door. When he got closer, his stomach dropped. Mongrel! The word slashed into the wood in ugly, shaking letters. He spat into the dust and walked away, but inside, a piece of him cracked and fell. Amara's cage grew tighter. Her father locked the doors after sunset. Her mother wept over her sewing, eyes hollow and accusing. Her youngest brother, Matteo, followed her like a shadow, ratting her out at the smallest suspicion. She wasn't stupid. She knew what the wedding dress her mother sewed day after day was for. It wasn't for her happiness. It was a chain disguised as lace. Then the betrayal came. It wasn't loud. It wasn't violent. It was worse. It was cold, quiet, and complete. One evening Ezra waited for hours by the crumbling vineyard wall. The sun bled out and the stars blinked open. She never came. Instead, 3 men came down the path, broad-shouldered, heavy-booted, carrying ropes. Ezra turned to run, but they were faster. Fists like stones slammed into him, knocking the air from his lungs. He fought back. Gods, he fought. But there were too many. Boots crushed his ribs. A rope tightened around his wrists. Blood filled his mouth, copper and bitter. Through the pain, through the rage, he understood. Someone had told them. Someone had led them here. Someone had betrayed them. When they were done, they left him broken in the dirt, wrists bound, ribs screaming, a savage message carved into his back with a knife. "Go back to your kind!" Amara sat at her window all night, staring into the black fields, hands shaking, nausea twisting her stomach. She hadn't betrayed him, but someone close to her had. Her brother Matteo had followed her, had listened, had whispered to their father. And now she didn't know if Ezra was dead or alive. She cried until her throat burned. She clawed at the wedding dress laid out on her bed until the stitches tore and the delicate fabric ripped into pieces. Her life, their life, was crumbling, and there was nothing she could do. The road to nowhere. Ezra healed slowly. The cracked ribs, the bruises, the deep gouges along his back, they all mended in crooked, aching ways. But the real damage sat deeper, inside, in the part of him that once believed he could belong here. He didn't anymore. He never would. Not after what they did to him. Not after the way the whole town turned their faces away, pretending not to see the limp in his walk, the split skin along his jaw. He packed at dawn. Only a threadbare bag, clothes, a flask of water, the few coins that hadn't been stolen from him. He left a note behind on a torn scrap of paper. "Amara, I waited. I bled. I can't stay. If you still love me, meet me where it all began, before sunset. Or don't. Either way, I will love you until the end of time." He folded it once, hands shaking, and slipped it under the vineyard gate where they once kissed, like the world was only theirs. Amara found the note hours later. She was supposed to be helping her mother bake bread. Instead, she slipped away, heart hammering, hands sticky with flour. When she saw the paper, when she read his handwriting, jagged and hurried, she nearly collapsed onto the dry earth. A choice. It was here. It was now. Stay, live the life carved for her in chains of duty and fear. Or run, chase a love already broken, bleeding, but still desperately, stubbornly alive. Tears blurred the words. She pressed the note against her chest and looked up at the pale sky, pleading to a God she no longer trusted. What should I do? There was no answer. There never was. The town buzzed like a hornet's nest that afternoon. Father Renato preached from the stone steps of the old chapel, his voice thick with rage. He spoke of sin, of punishment, of the need to purify the village from tainted blood. Amara watched him through the crowd, the bile rising in her throat. The same men who had beaten Ezra stood at the front, heads bowed, pretending repentance. She realized, with a cold, sick certainty, that even if she stayed, she would never be safe again. Even if she obeyed, they would still hate her for what her heart had dared to want. Sunset crept closer. Amara wrapped herself in a plain shawl. No shoes, no jewellery, nothing that could slow her down. She slipped out the back door while her mother and Matteo argued over supper. Her heart pounded with every step, every turn down the dusty streets, every whispered prayer that no one would see her. At the vineyard's edge, the world seemed to hold its breath. The fields glowed gold and blood red, and in the centre of it all, leaning heavily against the broken wall, stood Ezra. His face was gaunt, thinner than she remembered. His arm was bound in rough cloth, but his eyes, gods, his eyes, still burned when he saw her. He pushed off the wall, stumbled once, caught himself. "You came," he breathed, voice wrecked, barely human. She nodded, throat too tight to speak, and then they were running, not fast, not gracefully, but with every shred of strength left inside them, into each other's arms. The world blurred. Nothing else mattered. Not the town, not the bruises, not the impossible road ahead, only this, only now. "I don't care where we go," she sobbed into his chest. "I don't care if we have nothing. I just want you." Ezra pressed his lips against her forehead, breathing her in like he could live off the smell of her hair. "I'll find a way," he whispered. "I swear, Amara, I'll find a way to make us free." They clung to each other as the last light of the sun bled out over the hills. Two broken souls, stitched together by love, daring to hope, even when the world had given them every reason not to. The long escape. They didn't have a map. They didn't have much of anything. Only worn shoes, a flask of water, the coins Ezra had managed to hide, and the unbearable, unspoken terror that every footstep could be their last if they were caught. They chose the back trails, old paths worn thin by shepherds and forgotten farmers, winding deep into the hills beyond Ravenna. The fields gave way to thick woods. The trees swallowed the last of the light, turning the world into a maze of shadows. Ezra held Amara's hand the whole time, squeezing once every few minutes, as if reminding himself she was still there, that this wasn't some fever dream, that she hadn't stayed behind. "I know the woods," he whispered when the silence became too loud. "My grandfather used to hunt here before all this." Amara nodded, chest aching from more than just the climb. She tried not to think of her mother's face when she discovered the empty bed. Tried not to imagine Matteo's fists pounding on every door, demanding to know where she had gone. They would be hunted. They were already hunted. Hours passed. The cold settled in. Ezra's arm trembled from the strain of walking so long. His wound hadn't healed right, and each step was a fresh kind of agony. Still, he didn't complain. He only tightened his jaw and kept moving. Amara finally made him stop near a creek, under the heavy boughs of an old cypress tree. "Ezra, please," she whispered. "You'll collapse." He sank down onto the wet ground, breath ragged, face pale under the moonlight. "I'm fine," he lied. She knelt beside him, wrapping her shawl around them both. They sat like that for a long time, the freezing water whispering beside them, the stars flickering overhead like distant, uncaring eyes. Amara pressed her hand to his chest, feeling the uneven thud of his heart. "Don't die on me," she said, voice cracking. "I didn't leave everything for you to leave me now." He let out a broken laugh, bitter and soft. "I won't," he promised. "Not until I see you somewhere safe, somewhere they can't touch you." "Us," she wanted to say, but she knew Ezra wasn't thinking of himself anymore, only her. Morning came sluggish and grey. They moved slower now, every muscle screaming in protest, every step a battle. The mountains loomed in the distance. Beyond them, the coast. Beyond that, maybe ships, maybe escape, maybe a life no one could rip from them. But it was still days away, and by then, would they even have the strength left? By the second night, Ezra was feverish. He staggered when he walked, mumbled nonsense under his breath, flinched at shadows that weren't there. Amara supported him as best she could, her smaller frame barely enough to keep him upright. When he finally collapsed for good, it was in a clearing surrounded by wild rosemary bushes. She dropped to her knees beside him, shaking him, calling his name over and over. Nothing. Only the shallow, frantic flutter of his breath. She looked up at the trees, the endless, indifferent sky, Please, help us. But no help came. She did the only thing she could. She built a fire from dead branches, stoked it with shaking hands, and held Ezra close to the warmth. She sang to him, lullabies her mother had taught her when she was a child, songs of safe harbours and endless summers and home, even though she didn't believe the words anymore, even though home was nothing but ashes now. Tears ran down her face, hot and relentless. She wasn't ready to lose him, not after everything, not now. Somewhere deep in the night, Ezra stirred. His cracked lips formed her name. Amara. She crushed him against her, sobbing into his shoulder. I'm here, she whispered. I'm here. I'm not going anywhere. And for the first time in days, the weight in her chest eased just a little. They had 1,000 miles still to go, 1,000 dangers waiting for them. But tonight, under a sky so wide it could swallow them whole, they had each other. And that was enough to keep going. Betrayal in the woods. The woods were no longer silent. There was a feeling in the air, a wrongness, as if the trees themselves were holding their breath. Amara felt it first, a prickle at the back of her neck, a sense of being watched. She rose quietly from where Ezra lay dozing by the dying fire, every muscle coiled tight. At first, she thought it might just be animals, a fox maybe, or a wild dog. But then, the crack of a branch, heavy footsteps, human. Her heart slammed against her ribs. She bent down, shaking Ezra awake. Ezra, she hissed. Someone's coming. His eyes fluttered open, dazed and confused. Before he could say a word, a figure stepped into the clearing. It was someone she knew, someone she trusted. Giorgio Russo, a boy she had grown up with, Matteo's distant cousin. Quiet, lanky, awkward Giorgio, who used to sneak her sweets at festivals. He looked almost the same, except for the rifle slung across his back and the hard, calculating look in his eyes. Amara, he said, voice soft. I've been looking for you. Ezra tried to sit up, but his body betrayed him, crumpling back to the ground. Giorgio's gaze flicked to him, full of pity. Or maybe something darker. You can't run, Giorgio said gently, stepping closer. They'll tear this place apart by morning. The whole guard is after you. Amara stood between Giorgio and Ezra, chest heaving. Please, Giorgio, she whispered. Let us go. Giorgio's face twisted.